What's up, beautiful people? Today we're taking a look at the impact of the Spanish-American War and why I think William McKinley should be known as Mr. Worldwide. Now, where we left off in our last video was the Treaty of Paris, which would be signed in December of 1898. Spain agreed to free Cuba, and it also gave the US the islands of Guam in the Pacific, Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, and sold the Philippines to the US for $20 million. Now, while the Spanish-American War was militarily a relatively easy win, the political fight over the Treaty of Paris would be a tough one. The debate was a major turning point for the country as the US wrestled with whether or not it was going to go from a once weak nation to becoming an imperial power. By imperial power, there were those who argued the US should not grant freedom or full autonomy to Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, or the Philippines, as each country presented military, strategic, economic, political, and ideological opportunities that made many in the US argue the US should take over these territories and not withdraw from these regions. Now, not everyone was in favor of the US becoming an imperial power. There were all sorts of arguments made against annexation of these territories, and the most vocal opponents of the Treaty of Paris were the Anti-Imperialist League. They opposed the US taking over countries following the Treaty of Paris and the annexation of the Philippines. Members of the Anti-Imperialist League included such diverse people as Andrew Carnegie, Samuel Gompers, Mark Twain, and a whole bunch of other diverse individuals. And they all had their different reasons why the US should not become an imperial power. One reason, remember your boy Patrick Henry once said, "Give me liberty or give me death," during our big showdown with Great Britain. Some individuals argued to annex a country such as the Philippines would violate these principles of self-government outlined in the Declaration of Independence. Clearly, the Philippines and these other countries wanted to be free, and annexation would violate the principle of consent of the governed. Various others argued that it was best if the US handled its own racial issues and other social issues at home first, before trying to Christianize, civilize, or bring democracy to people in a faraway land. And leaders of organized labor, such as Samuel Gompers, worried that acquiring new territory would lead to lower wages for American workers. As immigrants from places such as the Philippines or Puerto Rico competed for American jobs, or American companies used overseas labor, the thought was this expansion would be bad for the American worker. In spite of these concerns, in February of 1899, the U.S. Senate approved the Treaty of Paris, thereby granting the U.S. new territory in Guam, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. Now the U.S. had to determine what they would do with this new territory. Now, McKinley belonged to the side that favored annexation of these territories. He was ready to become Mr. Worldwide. And for McKinley, the Spanish-American War was America's coming out party. It was our chance to assume a bigger role for the United States. Now, the biggest debate was over the future of the Philippines. Remember, in the Philippines, U.S. forces were joined by the Filipino independence movement led by Emilio Aguinaldo. Emilio and others hoped Spain would be kicked out and the Philippines would be allowed to be an independent nation. Shortly after the war was over, McKinley stated, "There was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and Christianize them." Now, beyond the obvious racist sentiments expressed in this quote, it's also pretty ridiculous because overwhelmingly the majority of Filipinos already were Christian due to Spanish colonization. Now, in McKinley's mind, they were the wrong types of Christians. They were Catholic mainly, but still, unfortunately, this is how many viewed the countries and the people in them that the US acquired at the end of the war. They were less than, they needed to be civilized. Filipinos were quite angry over the Treaty of Paris and the US decision to annex the Philippines. For the US, the Philippines was too good to pass up. The area had strategic advantages as a naval base, and it was a perfect jumping off point to the lucrative market in China. However, Emilio Aguinaldo and other Filipino revolutionaries believed they were promised independence when the war was over, and the end of the Spanish-American War led almost immediately to another war, the Philippine-American War. So it was not long after the Philippines received their independence from Spain, you could see Spain walking away in the distance with their bag of money, that the Filipino people rose in revolt against the United States. Unlike in places like Cuba, Puerto Rico, or even Hawaii, the resistance by the Filipino people against the U.S. US rule will be fierce and deadly. A couple of things to keep in mind about the Philippine-American War. Remember, the Spanish-American War lasted a few months. This war will last nearly 3 years and involved around 126,000 American troops who will be sent 10,000 miles away from the United States. The Filipino independence movement turned to guerrilla tactics to resist the militarily superior US forces. To combat this, similar to Spain's tactics in Cuba, to crush the independence movement, the US forced Filipino civilians to live in designated zones so they would not be able to aid the guerrilla fighters. Also similar to what happened in Cuba, poor sanitation, disease, and inadequate food led to thousands of Filipino people dying. This war not only will last longer than the Spanish-American War, but also way more Americans will be killed in the fight against the Philippines. The war led to the death of over 4,200 Americans and cost the US $400 million, or rather 20 times what the US paid to purchase the Philippines from Spain. In addition to this, a far greater toll was the Filipino lives lost. Roughly 20,000 Filipino rebels died in the resistance to the United States, and it is estimated that over 200,000 civilians died as well. After the Filipino independence movement was defeated, the US set up a government in the Philippines. This government had a governor which would be appointed by the US, and the Philippines would not be granted full independence until after World War II in 1946. Next up is Cuba, and remember, when we declared war against Spain, we were joining a fight against Spain that was already in progress. The Cuban people were fighting for their independence. With the Spanish-American War, the US recognized Cuba's independence from Spain. And remember, some people in the US justified the Spanish-American War on the grounds that we were fighting this war, at least partially, to defend the Cuban people and help them win their independence from their colonial ruler. Early on, the US passed the Teller Amendment, which stated the US would leave Cuba to govern themselves when the war was over. Basically, the US tells Cuba in the Teller Amendment, we have no intention of taking over Cuba. We're not trying to be Spain 2.0. Now, once the war is over with and the Treaty of Paris is signed, this would be the part where we would say happily ever after. But y'all know better by now, this ain't done. When the war was over, some American troops stayed behind for an American occupation of Cuba. The US did provide some humanitarian aid. They also did this in the Philippines, such as providing food and clothing to Cuban families, building schools, developing some infrastructure on the island, improving sanitation, and it helped the island nation of Cuba get rid of yellow fever, which was transmitted by mosquitoes and was quite deadly. Also during this time, the new Cuban government did write a constitution which would govern the newly independent nation. But nothing in the Cuban Constitution dealt with the relationship between Cuba and the United States. So the US insisted that Cuba make some additions to their new constitution. These additions become known as the Platt Amendment. Amongst these were, the US could intervene to restore peace and order. The US could do this unilaterally without Cuba's authorization. Cuba could not sign a treaty with a foreign nation that limited its independence or allowed a foreign country to control any part of Cuban territory. This is partly because in the Platt Amendment, the US was also able to buy or lease land in Cuba, which the US would take advantage of immediately in 1903 when the US entered into a lease for use of Guantanamo Bay to be used as a coaling station and naval base by the United States. The US still occupies this 28,000 acre area of Cuba, and it is one of many sources of bitterness between the two nations even to this day. Many Cubans felt betrayed by the United States' insistence that they accept the Platt Amendment, but US troops refused to withdraw from the island until Cuba adopted the Platt Amendment. And in the end, while Cuba was free from Spanish rule, thus no longer a colony, its sovereignty was basically limited, thereby making Cuba a U.S. protectorate, or a country whose affairs are in many ways controlled by a much stronger foreign power. So Cuba Libre basically becomes Cuba American Protectorate, which doesn't sound as cool. The status of Puerto Rico was also in question after the Spanish-American War. Would Puerto Rico be given independence made into a U.S. state? Would it become an American territory with some self-government? During the Spanish-American War, Puerto Rico was occupied by the U.S. military, and when the war was over, the U.S. military did not leave. One reason was, like Cuba, Puerto Rico was strategically important to the U.S. Access to this territory would allow the U.S. to maintain a military and economic presence in the Caribbean, and might come in handy if a canal was ever built somewhere in Central America. Spoiler alert, it will. A shift occurs in 1900, when in 1900, the Foraker Act is passed. With the act, Puerto Rico was granted limited degree of popular government. Basically, military rule was officially ended and a civilian government was set up. The act did withhold full self-rule. The President of the United States could appoint Puerto Rico's governor. The Puerto Rican people could only elect members of the lower house of the legislative branch. Basically, Puerto Rico was afforded the status of a territory of the United States. Getting an empire after the Spanish-American War raised new questions and led to the status of places such as Puerto Rico and the Philippines remaining uncertain. For instance, did the rights and protections under the U.S. Constitution follow the U.S. flag? Since these territories are now technically belonging to the United States, do the people living in those territories, you could see some famous Puerto Ricans right there, do they get the same rights as American citizens? The Supreme Court ruled in the insular cases, constitutional rights are not automatically extended to people in American territorial possessions. So people in the Philippines and Puerto Rico are subject to American rule, but they do not receive American rights. However, when it comes to Puerto Rico, Congress granted U.S. citizenship to Puerto Ricans in 1917, which means all the peeps you see right there are actually American citizens. The big idea, though, is after the Spanish-American War, the United States becomes an imperial power. We have territory overseas in the Caribbean, in Asia, and this is going to lead to new debates over American foreign policy, American identity, and we're going to look at these debates in some of our other videos. That's going to do it for now. Thank you for watching. Have a beautiful day. Peace.